1/5 of the world's oil passes through a corridor narrower than the length of Manhattan. For 17 days, that corridor has been virtually shut. Around 1,000 tankers sit idle, insurance companies have withdrawn coverage, and the price of crude has surged past $100 a barrel. Now, the President of the United States is publicly shaming his closest allies for refusing to send warships to help reopen it. The Strait of Hormuz, long theorized as the choke point that could bring the global economy to its knees, is no longer a theoretical risk. It is a daily reality, and the question of who should bear the cost of keeping it open has cracked open a fault line at the heart of the Western alliance that may prove harder to repair than the strait itself. On Monday, March 16, 2026, President Donald Trump used a public event at the White House to lament that allied nations had rejected American requests to contribute warships to an escort operation in the Strait of Hormuz. He said several countries had told him they were sending naval assets, though he declined to name any of them. He reserved sharper words for those who had not responded with enthusiasm, saying, according to Reuters, that the United States had protected some of these nations for decades, only to be met with indifference when Washington asked for help in return. The day before, in an interview with the Financial Times, Trump was more explicit. He warned that NATO would face a very difficult future if allies did not help secure the strait. He singled out British Prime Minister Keir Starmer for declining to immediately deploy aircraft carriers, while praising French President Emmanuel Macron for agreeing to reposition the aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle to the eastern Mediterranean, freeing up American carrier assets for the Arabian Sea. The backdrop to this diplomatic friction is the 2026 Iran war. On February 28, the United States and Israel launched joint strikes against Iran in what Washington dubbed Operation Epic Fury. The opening salvo killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and struck military, nuclear, and government facilities across Iran. Tehran responded with waves of missiles and drones aimed at Israel, American bases across the Middle East, and several Gulf states. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps subsequently imposed what amounts to a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, declaring that vessels linked to the United States, Israel, or their allies would be treated as legitimate targets. Tanker traffic through the strait dropped to near zero within days. At least 10 oil tankers have been attacked or damaged since the conflict began, according to United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations data. The Strait of Hormuz has been a pressure point in global geopolitics for decades, but the current crisis has no true precedent in scale. The closest historical parallel is the tanker war of the 1980s, when Iran and Iraq attacked commercial shipping during their 8-year conflict. Between 1981 and 1988, the two sides struck more than 400 vessels, killing over 100 merchant sailors. In response, the Reagan administration launched Operation Earnest Will in July 1987, reflagging Kuwaiti tankers under the American flag and providing naval escorts through the Persian Gulf. It became the largest convoy operation since World War II, involving at its peak more than 30 United States Navy ships, including carriers and the battleship Missouri. But the differences between 1987 and 2026 are significant. During the tanker war, the strait itself was never fully closed. Shipping continued, albeit at higher risk and cost. Today, traffic has effectively stopped. Iran's arsenal has also evolved dramatically. The Revolutionary Guard now deploys anti-ship cruise missiles, naval mines potentially numbering in the thousands, explosive drones, fast attack boats, and unmanned surface vessels, capabilities that did not exist at their current sophistication nearly 4 decades ago. As Alessio Padalano, professor of war and strategy at King's College London, told CNN, the depth of naval capability among potential coalition nations is simply not what it was in the 1980s, with fleets and their support structures now a fraction of what they once were. The broader chain of events leading to the current crisis stretches back years. After the United States withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018, Tehran steadily advanced its enrichment capabilities. The 12-day war between Israel and Iran in June 2025 inflicted significant damage on Iranian military infrastructure. Massive anti-government protests erupted inside Iran in late 2025 and January 2026, with thousands killed in a government crackdown. Indirect nuclear negotiations showed promise in February 2026, with Oman's foreign minister saying a breakthrough had been reached just 1 day before the strikes began. That diplomatic track was destroyed in a matter of hours when Operation Epic Fury commenced. The geopolitical chessboard around the Strait of Hormuz involves an unusually wide array of actors, each operating under distinct and often competing pressures. The United States initiated the military campaign against Iran alongside Israel, with stated objectives including the destruction of Iran's nuclear and missile capabilities and, according to some administration officials, regime change. Washington now finds itself managing the economic fallout of a war it started, particularly the energy supply disruption it did not fully anticipate or prepare for. Trump has framed the escort request as a test of alliance loyalty, telling reporters he was making the request in part to see how allies react because, in his words, he has said for years that if the United States ever needed help, its partners would not be there. For European allies, the calculus is more complicated. The United Kingdom, France, Germany, and other NATO members were not consulted before the strikes on Iran, according to Edward Fishman of the Council on Foreign Relations. They now face pressure to contribute militarily to secure a waterway disrupted by a war they did not choose and in some cases publicly opposed. Prime Minister Starmer has said the United Kingdom will not be drawn into a wider war, while signaling willingness to work on a collective plan to restore shipping. France has been more cooperative, repositioning its carrier, but the broader European stance is cautious. Germany, Italy, and Greece have explicitly refused to join military operations in the Strait, according to Reuters. Japan and South Korea, both heavily dependent on Middle Eastern oil, face acute energy security concerns. Japan imports approximately 70% of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. Yet Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi told Parliament that Tokyo had made no decisions on dispatching escort ships, citing legal constraints on overseas military deployments under Japan's constitution. South Korea has not committed either. Naval analysts note that South Korean minesweepers are not designed for extended deployment in high-threat environments far from home. China presents perhaps the most intriguing dynamic. Beijing is a major importer of Gulf oil, yet Iran has reportedly been allowing Chinese-linked vessels to transit the strait. Barbara Slavin of the Stimson Center told Al Jazeera she highly doubted China would send warships, noting that Iranian oil continues to flow to China. Beijing has called on all parties to halt military operations and avoid further escalation, a position that allows it to maintain relations with Tehran while benefiting from continued energy access. Iran, despite the devastating strikes on its leadership and military infrastructure, retains significant asymmetric capabilities in the Hormuz corridor. The IRGC's naval commander stated that the strait had not been militarily blocked but was merely under control. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi clarified that the waterway remained open to all shipping except that belonging to the United States, Israel, and their allies. Iran has selectively allowed passage to Indian, Turkish, and Chinese vessels, using access to the strait as diplomatic leverage. India has pursued its own path. External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar told the Financial Times that direct negotiations with Tehran had allowed 2 Indian-flagged gas tankers to pass through the strait. India's approach of bilateral engagement rather than military participation illustrates how non-Western powers are navigating the crisis on their own terms. The economic consequences of the Hormuz closure are already severe and growing worse by the day. According to the United States Energy Information Administration, approximately 20 million barrels of oil per day transited the strait in 2024, representing roughly 20% of global seaborne oil trade. That flow has been reduced to what the International Energy Agency described as a trickle. Oil prices tell part of the story. Brent crude surpassed $105 per barrel on March 16th, according to CNBC, a roughly 40% increase since the war began. American gasoline prices have risen by more than 50 cents per gallon, according to factcheck.org, reaching an average of $3.70. The International Energy Agency took the unprecedented step of releasing 400 million barrels from strategic reserves to cushion the shock. But oil is far from the only commodity affected. According to CNBC, roughly 1/3 of global fertilizer trade transits the Strait of Hormuz. Urea prices at the New Orleans fertilizer hub have jumped from $475 per metric ton to $680 per metric ton, arriving just as American farmers enter the spring planting window for soybeans and corn. About 30% of Europe's jet fuel supply originates from or passes through the strait, and roughly 20% of global liquefied natural gas shipments transit the waterway, nearly all from Qatar. When Iranian drones struck Qatari gas facilities in the first days of the conflict, Qatar Energy halted production, and European natural gas futures nearly doubled, according to Time magazine. Goldman Sachs economists, in a report cited by Axios, modeled a scenario where oil averages $98 per barrel through April, projecting it would add nearly a full percentage point to United States inflation and trim growth by 0.3 of a point. In a more extreme scenario of sustained $110 oil, they raised their estimated probability of recession to 25%. Oxford Economics warned that a sustained price of $140 per barrel could push the Eurozone, the United Kingdom, and Japan into economic contraction. Iraq has already cut production by 1.5 million barrels per day as storage capacity fills with nowhere to send exports, according to Reuters. JP Morgan analysts warned that if Gulf producers exhaust storage, forced production shutdowns could spike Brent to $120 per barrel. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development issued a report warning that developing economies with high energy import dependence face the greatest risk, as rising costs strain public finances and household budgets. The debate over the Hormuz escort mission exposes a deeper structural tension within the Western alliance system. Analysts offer starkly different readings of what is unfolding. Edward Fishman of the Council on Foreign Relations pointed out that the Trump administration did not consult European or Asian allies before launching military action against Iran, even though those allies are far more dependent on Gulf oil than the United States. This, in his assessment, raises the question of whether Washington can reasonably expect concessions and military support from partners who had no say in the decision that created the crisis. Seth Jones of the Center for Strategic and International Studies told CBS News that the military is likely preparing for escorts by first degrading Iranian coastal capabilities through airstrikes, suggesting that escort operations will not begin until Washington is confident the threat environment has been sufficiently reduced. Energy Secretary Chris Wright confirmed this sequencing, stating that all military assets were currently focused on destroying Iran's offensive capabilities. Naval analysts emphasize the operational complexity of any escort mission. According to CNN, the strait is only about 10 miles across at its narrowest point, with navigable space for large tankers even more constrained. Carl Schuster, a former director of operations at the United States Pacific Command's Joint Intelligence Center, told CNN that Iran has been developing asymmetric naval tactics since the late 1980s, including drones, fast attack boats, and unmanned surface vessels. He described the strait as a death valley for naval operations. The question of alliance burden sharing is not new. NATO members have faced persistent American criticism over defense spending, and Trump's transactional approach to alliances dates back to his first term. But analysts note that this case is distinct. According to NPR, Starmer explicitly ruled out a NATO mission, saying the United Kingdom would defend itself and its allies but would not be drawn into a wider war. This suggests European capitals view the Hormuz crisis not as an Article 5 collective defense scenario, but as a consequence of a unilateral American military decision. Some observers see an emerging pattern of selective engagement. Christian Buger, professor of international relations at the University of Copenhagen, told Al Jazeera that Europe faces a major energy supply crisis if the strait is not reopened, but that the shipping industry currently finds it impossible to transit safely. The European Union discussed expanding its Aspides naval mission, originally created to protect shipping from Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, though according to CNBC, those talks were not expected to extend operations to the Strait of Hormuz. The reverberations of the Hormuz crisis extend far beyond the Middle East. In Asia, the impact is most acute. According to CNBC, China, India, Japan, and South Korea account for nearly 70% of oil shipments through the strait. Japan holds only 2 to 4 weeks of liquefied natural gas reserves, according to energy consultancy Kepler, and South Korea's situation is similarly tight. Pakistan has officially requested that Saudi Arabia reroute oil supplies through its Red Sea port at Yanbu, according to reports. Bangladesh has closed universities early for the summer, while Pakistan and the Philippines declared 4-day work weeks to reduce energy consumption, according to Reuters. In Europe, the crisis compounds existing energy security concerns that emerged during the 2022 disruptions following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. European Union Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas said on Monday that keeping the strait open is in Europe's interest and that discussions are underway about what can be done from the European side. But concrete commitments have been scarce. The head of Saudi Arabia's state oil company warned the Financial Times that continued war would produce drastic effects on the world economy. Saudi Aramco has begun rerouting some exports through the Red Sea, but the capacity of alternative routes is limited, with the Energy Information Administration estimating that only about 2.5 million barrels per day of Saudi and Emirati oil can be redirected. The disruption has also stalled diplomatic processes elsewhere. According to reports, the international focus on the Hormuz crisis has quietly frozen negotiations over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam between Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia, as mediators, including the United States and the African Union, have redirected diplomatic resources. Ethiopia, which imports the vast majority of its refined petroleum from the Gulf, faces severe price shocks. International Monetary Fund chief Kristalina Georgieva warned that every 10% increase in energy prices sustained over the course of 2026 is expected to raise global inflation by nearly half a percentage point. Major shipping companies including Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd have suspended Middle East routes. Formula One canceled the Bahrain and Saudi Arabia Grand Prix races scheduled for April, citing safety concerns. The economic ripple effects are widening by the day. Several developments in the coming days and weeks will determine the trajectory of this crisis. Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi is scheduled to visit the White House on Thursday, March 19th. Her meeting with Trump will likely center on the Hormuz escort request, and any commitment from Tokyo, even a limited one, would represent a significant shift in Japan's post-war security posture. The European Union's deliberations on expanding the Aspides naval mission bear close monitoring. Any decision to extend its mandate to the Strait, even in a limited capacity, would signal a shift in European willingness to engage militarily in the Gulf. On the military front, the pace and effectiveness of American and Israeli strikes against Iranian coastal defenses and missile infrastructure will determine when escort operations can realistically begin. Energy Secretary Wright's acknowledgement that the United States is not yet ready to escort tankers suggests a gap of at least days, if not weeks. The Israeli military has told CNN it has at least 3 more weeks of targets to strike. Oil markets remain the most sensitive barometer. If Brent crude moves sustainably above $120 per barrel, the economic calculus changes dramatically for every major economy. A decision by the G7 to coordinate further releases from strategic petroleum reserves would signal growing alarm about the duration of the disruption. Iran's selective opening of the strait to certain nations, including India, Turkey, and China, is worth watching closely. If Tehran continues to use access as a diplomatic tool, it could fracture the international response, making a unified coalition even harder to assemble. Watch also for any signals from Iran's new leadership, particularly Mojtaba Khamenei, regarding conditions for a broader reopening of the waterway. What began as an American demand for Allied warships has revealed something more fundamental. The architecture of global security built over decades is being stress-tested in ways its designers never fully anticipated. The United States launched a war without consulting its partners, and now asks those partners to help manage the consequences. The partners, meanwhile, face a genuine energy crisis but are reluctant to be drawn into a conflict they did not choose. And Iran, battered and diminished, has found in the Strait of Hormuz the one piece of leverage that the world's most powerful military cannot simply bomb away. The 21 miles of water between Iran and Oman have become a mirror, reflecting the true state of alliances, the limits of military power, and the fragility of an interconnected global economy that depends, more than most people ever realize, on the free passage of ships through a narrow corridor of sea.